miss any opportunity to fit everything in and hear all of the great presentations and questions from folks. So we'll get started. My name is Tara Britton. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for the Center for Community Solutions. Thank you to everyone for joining us this morning for the second day of our Budget Training Academy that we have switched to a virtual format this year. Today, we are going to talk about communicating your message. And I want to briefly just go over a little background on Community Solutions, a few logistics before I turn it over to our speakers today. Community Solutions improves health, social, and economic conditions through nonpartisan research, policy analysis, communications, and advocacy. You can see here on your screen, our policy priorities really run the gamut on health and human services, ranging from advancing well-being of older adults, enhancing behavioral health access, improving maternal and infant health, strengthening the health and human services safety net, and supporting sound Medicaid policy. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. I know many of you have attended in-person trainings around the budget that we've hosted in the past. A few years ago, we had an in-person 2-day training at the Sheraton on Capitol Square focused on the Medicaid budget that I know folks joined us for, and we were able to break out into small groups and do some group work and take what we learned and apply it and have a reception with policymakers, so we can look forward to all of that in the coming years. So this year, we transitioned things into a virtual format. I know today is going to be a really great refresher, and also I'm sure some first-time information for folks around, we call it kind of advocacy in motion or advocacy capacity, to really just kind of gain an understanding of how to engage with policymakers. So our staff, William Tarter Jr. and Natasha Techi-Micah, are going to kick us off for the advocacy capacity training to talk about, really all of those things, kind of how to engage with policymakers. We've tweaked it a little bit, I think, to accommodate the virtual nature of a lot of the work that we will be doing for the next several months. And then we will, there'll be a little bit of an interactive piece that we're going to poll folks in between Will and Natasha's portion of the presentation before we turn it over to Scarlett Bowder, who's the president and co-founder of Advocacy and Communication Solutions. She is going to talk about how to engage virtually. So lots of tips for this sort of new temporary world we're in to engage with policymakers in the coming months as we head into the state budget. So today's agenda, I think, is a really great complement to the content from last week, which really kind of laid the groundwork for some of the major health and human service provisions, or at least generally sort of policy agenda in those spaces that we can anticipate going into next year. So with that, I will turn it over to Will. Thank you all for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tara, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present in today's session. We're going to talk about a few components of communication and advocacy, and we're going to offer some suggestions on how to create a strong message that will resonate with the people who you will be speaking to in the coming months. There's a lot of major decisions that are going to be made in the next 12 months, including the state budget, the transportation budget, the county budget, and how can you strengthen your argument and make sure that it resonates with decision makers. So I'm really excited to be here this morning and look forward to the conversation today. Go to the next slide, please. We're going to cover this in two parts. The first is some of the basics of advocacy, which we affectionately call Advocacy 101. And then my colleague Natasha is going to talk about data integrity and ensuring that the data that you mention in your presentations resonates with your audience. We'll go to the next slide. So let's talk about Advocacy 101. The first thing that we need to understand is the differences between advocacy and lobbying. If we can go to the next slide. There's a common misconception about advocacy and lobbying, and that nonprofits are not able to engage in advocacy or lobbying. And the reality is that when it comes to advocacy, there is a difference between advocacy and lobbying. And we're going to talk about some of the basics of that today. The advocacy piece is that you are educating people about policy. And there's a difference between making the case for how policies will impact you versus advocating for or against specific pieces of legislation. We're going to talk about 4 advocacy methods, and then we're going to talk about how you can communicate effectively with those elected officials. Now go to the next slide, please. Now, why should you advocate? If you're a nonprofit leader, or if you're a person who's involved in the community, you're involved in public service, and public service is an honorable calling. And we appreciate all the great work that goes into community service on a regular basis. But we also understand that it is so important not for the work to stay just out in the community, but also to resonate with the people who are making funding decisions and policy decisions that impact your agency. So advocacy is really important, both in external communication to the community, but also communication into policymakers. Why is this important? Because government policies affect everyone. They will make sure that policies that are positive to your agency, or they could be detrimental to your agency. So you want to make sure that they have the most up-to-date information in terms of what is the current case of things and how things can change. Government also controls funding for important services. So you're talking about how policies in Columbus or in downtown Cleveland or in Washington, all of them are intertwined in terms of how the federal budget impacts the state budget, impacts the county budget, and so on and so forth. So you want to make sure that the right decision makers are familiar with your policies. These policymakers care about and need your expertise. They might have experiences in one area, but they might not be as familiar with others. So the information you provide to them is critical to helping them make informed choices. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we're going to talk about a high-level difference between education, advocacy, and lobbying. Education is being a resource. You're sharing information with people on a regular basis just about what is going on in your agency or how your programs shape policy, literally providing information only. You see this a lot in organizations like Legal Aid, where they just provide information on issues that affect the population. Now, advocacy is working on issues. These are issues that affect your agency or something you're passionate about, like homelessness or transportation, but might not necessarily be specific pieces of legislation. And that's where you cross into the realm of lobbying, where you're working on specific pieces of legislation, proponent or opponent, and it's something that you're being paid to do. Go to the next slide, please. So when we talk about advocacy, advocacy is public support or recommendation for a particular cause or policy. Again, super high level. You're talking about a particular topic and how it impacts your organization or the work that you do on a regular basis. So if there was an increase in funding for X, then we would be able to do Y. These are some of the things we're talking about in terms of the impact on your organization. Now, advocacy can be used in the promotion of a cause or principle. Oftentimes, it leads to a selected goal. So say you're trying to serve X number of people and you need additional support in order to be able to do it. Advocacy is a great way to sharing your information and talking about the importance and the impact that your work has in the community. However, advocacy is just one way to approach a problem. Advocacy does not necessarily involve confrontation or conflict. Activism also plays a role in terms of being able to elevate the message to the community. Advocacy has a role to play as well as direct diplomacy and communication. So at each step of the way in the making change spectrum, advocacy is just one way to approach an issue. Go to the next slide, please. So we're talking about advocacy, which is really important. That is talking about a cause or issue. But there is a line that is very bright, and we call that lobbying. And lobbying, and I want to really circle this word, working to influence the outcome of a specific piece of legislation or executive agency decision. When you're working, when you're being paid to change legislation. There are very strict rules and guidelines, IRS rules and whatnot, and reporting that go into what you can and cannot do, what you can and cannot say. So you want to make sure that if you're working for a particular cause or issue and you have to talk about a specific piece of legislation or decision, that you make sure that you're aware of your lobbying activities and you track them. Now, there are different types of lobbying. Direct lobbying is the direct interaction with a decision maker. Grassroots lobbying is you're encouraging others to interact with a decision maker. So you're urging your friends, your circles to contact the legislator and tell them to vote yes on X bill or vote no on Y bill, whatever the case might be. Those are grassroots lobbying. Now, again, lobbying is a legal term that's defined by the IRS. So you want to make sure that you're very clear in terms of what you are able to do as an agency and if you pay people to lobby or not. Why? Because money spent on lobbying needs to be tracked, and there are limits on how much you can spend. Go to the next slide, please. Now, we're going to talk about how you can make sure that whatever message you're communicating, whether you're education, advocacy, or lobbying, policymakers find a way to say yes to your advocacy. Now, the first thing is if they have a relationship with you. If you communicate with them on a regular basis and you tell them about the work that you're doing and they know that you are a go-to resource for information on a particular issue. One of the books that I love to recommend to people is a book called So Good They Can't Ignore You by Cal Newport. And he talks about how you as a person or organization can become a destination for people who are looking for information about a particular topic because they know you are an expert on that issue. And so if you have a relationship with a policymaker that you have been in communication with them for years on end and not just when it's budget season, that's really important and one that you can use to your advantage when you are communicating a message. But they also have to trust the information that you present. You want to make sure that the information is accurate. And Natasha's going to talk about data integrity later on in this presentation. Policymakers also need to know who you speak for. If you are a person who is a representative of an agency, a representative of an organization, they need to know how many people you are representing. Is it 500? Is it 1,000? So it's not just you speaking, you're speaking on behalf of an entire network. They also need to know how you relate to their community and their constituents. So if you have the opportunity to present data from their home district, then that resonates in a different way because they know that this policy or this issue directly affects the people that they were elected to represent. Community Solutions has on its webpage community fact sheets where you can go to specific state house areas or state senate districts and find data that will directly correlate to the policymaker who you are speaking to. And they also need to know if you have strong media relationships. If you have the opportunity to talk to people and say, hey, if I would like to invite you to walk through our food pantry. And if you would like, we can ask a member of the media to join us so that they can see that this is a big issue that you feel passionately about. Go to the next slide, please. So we're going to very quickly talk about 4 advocacy methods: the personal phone call, the personal letter, the personal visit, even in a virtual environment, and the personal email. Let's go to the personal phone call. Now, what things do all 4 of these things have in common? Personal. So if there was a title to this sermon, it would be Make It Personal. Let's first talk about the personal phone call. The next slide, please. In the personal phone call, the first thing that you should do is not expect to speak to a legislator. When you call Senator Brown's office, you are probably not going to speak to Senator Brown or Senator Portman, but you will speak to their legislative aide who does talk to Senator Brown or Senator Portman. So make sure that you are nice because those staff members are like gatekeepers. You want to make sure that when you're talking to them, or you're talking to a state legislative aide, it's as if you're talking to the legislator, him or herself. So do not expect to speak to the legislator, but do expect that you'll speak to her staff. So make sure that you're courteous. Be pleasant to the staff. Ask for the name of the person that you're speaking with. Here's one tip. If you'd like to ask, how do they spell their name? If it's Brian, is it B-R-I-A-N or B-R-Y-A-N? And the reason why this is helpful is, number one, it helps you to remember who it is you're talking to so you can reference it in the future. But also, if they spell their name a particular way, it helps for them to be able to share that with you, and you can keep that in mind in the future. They'll appreciate the fact that you asked. Let them know if you're a constituent, although phone ID can tell them that already. If you're a constituent, that means a lot because you are a voter. And so whatever you're saying, or if you're calling on behalf of, say, a nursing home or an organization that has a large amount of constituents in your district, that resonates in a different way because this is the people who they are elected to represent. But try to sound like yourself. Don't necessarily read from a script and be like, hello, my name is William Tarter. I would like to talk to you about public transportation and why it's so important. If you sound like yourself and you share your story, that's going to resonate in a whole different way because no one knows your story better than you. Hi, my name is Will Tarter. I take the bus to get to where I need to go, and right now it takes me about 45 minutes. But if this change is made, it will prolong my trip by another 15 minutes going and another 15 minutes coming back. That's a half hour less than I'm able to spend time at work or with my kids, and really has a dramatic impact on my schedule. So whatever the case might be, it's your story that you're telling that will resonate with the person you're trying to speak with. And that takes us to the next point. Know your expertise. What gives you credibility? If this is something that you've been doing for the past 15 years, let them know. I'm a nurse. I've been at the front lines. I've seen these things in action. I've seen the dramatic effects of this policy, whatever the case might be. What is the credibility that gives you expertise to speak on that issue? But keep it short. Don't go into a long diatribe. Be able to present your point clearly and concisely. But be a good listener. When you're sharing your story, that's really important. But you also want to give the staff member the opportunity to hear from you give them the opportunity to hear from them so that they can share their particular viewpoint that you may be interested in knowing. Is there some common ground that we can find moving forward? Have a clear ask. I would like to invite you to walk through a nonprofit and to talk to the people who are impacted by this issue. I invite you to take a bus ride and see what it's like to take a bus on a regular basis. So I would encourage you to have a clear ask when you are presenting your phone call. Next slide, please. Personal letter. Now, in the personal letter, again, in this environment, a lot of people send emails, which is fine. But people who write a personal letter, it takes a lot of time. You have to go grab a piece of paper. You have to go find a pen. You have to go sit down at a desk and write it out. Get an envelope, find the address, put in the envelope, put a stamp on it, find a stamp, put a stamp on it, and then take it to the post office. That takes time. So when you write a handwritten letter, it's a very powerful thing to receive. And for legislators, they receive all sorts of powerful letters. If it is from a child and it's written in crayon, if it's a senior and it's talking about food insecurity and it's written on a paper plate, these are things that resonate with legislators because it's not just someone went to a computer, typed up a 15-second email and clicked send. When you relate your experiences, it's a way, again, that you're sharing your story in a way that only you can share. So you want to make sure that you put that in your personal letter. Keep it short and sweet. Again, don't have like a 6 or 7 page essay, but if you can keep it to half a page or 1 page, explaining your cause or issue, why it's important, the impact or issues that you're worried about or you want to see happen, describe that in that letter. If you can handwrite it, awesome. That, again, takes time to do and is more rare because of how immersed we are in a digital environment. Always include your home address. A lot of times legislators will respond to you and will provide an address to acknowledge receipt of that letter. So you want to make sure you provide an address for them to write back to. And if you want, ask for a reply so that they know they can send either response to your question or issue, or they can at least acknowledge that they received it and you can use that for your future reference. Next slide, please. Now, this is an example of, in this particular case, the Honorable Marcia L. Fudge, who is my congresswoman. You want to make sure that you put the honorable if it's an elected official, the governing body, and the address. And please, I beg of you, spell their name correctly. It's an attention to detail when you spell their name correctly that is really important, so that they know that you took time to check all the information, make sure it was right, and you put it in the envelope and you sent it in. Next slide, please. The next slide, please. All right, there we go. The personal visit. Now, we understand that we're in this virtual environment, and we're going to hear a great presentation a little bit later about how to adapt some things we're going to talk about. But in this personal visit, even if it's in a virtual environment, some of the same things still matter. Schedule the meeting in advance. So when you're talking about, I'd like to set up a 5 to 10 minute conversation with you to talk about the issues that we're seeing in the community, and make sure that the legislator, if they're able to attend, or the legislative aide, knows exactly how long you need, what topic you want to cover, and you can make sure that your visit is impactful. Schedule the meeting with a legislator and other constituents if possible. If you can bring in constituents who can talk about the particular issue and how it impacts them, it's not just you as the organizational leader or member who is sharing that cause or issue, but you're also bringing in the stories of people who are impacted by you as well, or by that issue as well. So if you can bring in constituents, that's awesome. But don't have too many, because you don't want to have a cacophony of voices that are trying to attack a person. You want to have maybe 1 or 2 people who can speak to a particular cause or issue. The legislator might be able to ask questions of that person and say, hey, I thought that this was the case. Are you telling me that it's actually different than what I thought? Yes, absolutely. And here's why, X, Y, and Z. Dress appropriately, even in digital environment. If you could wear a coat or a sweater or something like that, again, it goes a long way in presentation. Be on time and early if possible, but don't be surprised if you have to wait. Even in this digital environment, committee meetings still go long, meetings still go long. It doesn't mean that your meeting is not important. It just means that they're trying to wrap that meeting up before they can give you their undivided attention in your meeting. Start with a comment and thank them first. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with me on this particular issue. I know that you're busy, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be with me today. Personalize the issue. Again, talking about how the issue impacts you and how it impacts the people who you serve. Very, very important. Be a good listener. Again, try and find if there's areas of common ground, and then build from there, and have a clear ask. Again, what is it that you're trying to get done, you're trying to see happen, and make sure that they're aware of why the issue is of importance to you. Next slide, please. The personal email. Again, sometimes people are only able to write an email, which is fine. We understand if people need to get a message delivered quickly, then they will send an email. Make sure, again, that if you do send an email, that you keep some things in mind. We'll talk about this in just a minute. But make sure, again, when you send it, that you're nice and you're courteous. And again, just make sure that if you're going to communicate via email, that it's in a way that doesn't turn the person off when they open it. Again, personal emails are preferred to form style emails, where it's we'll just sign our name to a script where you get 1,000 messages that are all saying the exact same thing. It's much more impactful to have 1,000 people who are sharing their stories. Next slide, please. Social media. Don't be afraid to talk to legislators via social media. A lot of policymakers have Facebook or Twitter, and they will use that to interact with their constituents. And sometimes as organizational leaders, we will share information that we want to bring to the attention of a legislator. So we may tag them in a post to start that conversation or to inform them of a particular cause or issue. You can encourage your followers to share or retweet, to talk and engage with those legislators directly and say, hey, if you are infected by this story, please send a message to this elected official and let them know about what it is that you are passionate about and that you care about. You can use graphics or tables, photos and videos to accentuate your point. But I want to warn you, when you use social media, you can control what you say. You cannot control what people say after you. So if you're encouraging people to say something or to encouraging people to talk to an elected official, you want to make sure that you do it in a way that is reflective of you, because you then will be associated with the people who are contacting that elected official at your encouragement. So you want to make sure, again, that it is a courteous thing. It's something that you're encouraging people to do, but something that doesn't damage the relationship moving forward, which in this day and age is very easy to do in the social media environment. If you are using emails, please do not use all capital letters. Why? Because it's going to seem like you're yelling at them. And again, it's very, very difficult in a digital environment to talk to people in a way that they can fully understand what it is you're trying to say. When we were in person, or even now, you can see body language, hand gestures, eye contact. And right now in this social media environment, when you send an email or you're talking with someone on social media, if you put it in all caps, it's as if you're screaming at them. And that does not help at all. Go to the next slide, please. All right. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to share this presentation with you. I hope that this Advocacy 101 was helpful. Now let's talk about how the data is so important and data integrity is so important. So I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Natasha.
Thank you, Will. All right, so again, my name is Natasha, and I will talk about data integrity and why it's important to present data to legislators and how you can do that. Next slide. So why is it important to present research during advocacy? One of the reasons why it's important to present data is because research is the foundation for advocacy. So one of the ways you can think about this is that data can support your claim and address counter arguments. And also data can help modify policies or introduce a new policy. Another reason why it's important to present data during advocacy is because research can identify problems or solutions within your community. So sometimes legislators may not be aware of a social or health issue within your community. For example, if you work for a nonprofit organization where you are trying to reduce maternal deaths within your county, you can easily state a statistic such as 20% of African American women die while giving birth. And you can also present the following zip codes within that county. As for solutions, you can talk about interventions that has worked in your community. So you can talk about any home site visiting sites that has worked well, and it actually caused African American mothers to have successful births without any pregnancy related issues. Next slide. So how do you advocate with research when talking with legislators? First, you don't want to use jargon, but clear language. Many of us are from different industries where we use a set of vocabulary that the general public or even legislators do not understand. So it's best to present research in easier terms so it could be understandable to your audience. Also, some industries use acronyms, especially in public health in my field and public policy. So if you are going to talk about acronym, make sure that you describe what it means first. Second, you want to pick a key statistic or anecdote supported by other evidence. So you don't want to just rely on one piece of research, but you have to back up that research with other papers, statistics, and you can look for that through various avenues. So for instance, if you want to highlight an intervention that is successful according to one research paper, then you want to find other research papers and scholarly articles or websites that also show that the intervention has been successful, because when you do that, it provides leverage. Third, you want to look for research about interventions or policies that have worked in other locations. And by doing that, the legislators can get a feel of what has worked and have what has worked in other locations, and pretty much it's better not to reinvent the wheel. Fourth and finally, you can use graphics, charts, icons, or testimonies. So when you use graphics like bar graphs or pie graphs, charts or icons, they are more visually appealing, and you can show data in a quantitative manner to legislators. Whereas if you use testimonies, they are more persuasive. Next slide. So where can you find research? The first thing you should ask yourself is, are you already collaborating with other organizations or individuals? If so, you can ask for them for anecdotes or data. They are a good starting point in your search for data. Another avenue in which you can find research is colleges and universities. And there are professors who have expertise on certain topics concerning health or social issues. And they can be willing to share their published work with you so you can present it to legislators. You can also refer to health departments and governmental agencies. So health departments at the local level or the county level. And then you can also look at governmental agencies in the federal level, like the CDC. You can refer to professional organizations because they also provide published work on their websites. And especially if you are a member of one of those organizations, you easily have access to that research. And lastly, you can look at organizations that work directly on the issue. So I'm referring to grassroots organizations. So for example, if you are trying to present data on HIV and trying to find ways to reduce the rates of HIV, you can talk to a grassroots organization that strictly focus on HIV reduction. Next slide. So now I'm going to briefly talk about data visualization and how you can present it to legislators, whether you create it on your own or you found it through different research sources that I've talked about before. So here, as you can see, we have an example of a good graph and a bad graph. And I want to pinpoint that it's important to pick a graph that people can easily detect. So on the left, we have an example of a bad graph, and this graph is a 3D graph, and it's pretty bad because you cannot really pinpoint the exact value at the end of each bar. You don't know if that exact value is at the front line or actually at the shadow part of each bar. So it's kind of hard to see the values. Whereas looking into the group graph, it is a 2D graph, so it's very simple to view the bars and you can most likely pinpoint the values of each bar. Next slide. And also icons are good. So here at the Center for Community Solutions, we use icons to describe various stats. So it's easy to compare groups using icons and visually appealing. So on the left, you can see the rate of deaths between African-American babies and white babies. And then on the right, you can see the rates of poverty, children living in poverty between Black and white children. And you can see, like, you can easily highlight how many of these children who are white live in poverty compared to how many children who are Black living in poverty. Next slide. So in summary, data is the foundation for advocacy. There are many ways to present data to legislators through charts, graphs, anecdotes, icons, or testimonies. And finally, there are many sources to look for research to support your advocacy efforts. So don't be afraid to reach out to organizations you are already collaborating with, colleges and universities, professional organizations, and so on. Next slide. Next slide. All right, well, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend our webinar. We will go to our Q&A section, but if you have any questions or comments, even after the webinar, feel free to email Will or I. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Natasha and Will. That was great and a lot of information packed into 35 minutes. So we really appreciate how thorough that training was. We did have Will, we got a question about the title of the book that you mentioned as a reference. So I think I found the right one and put it in the chat, but if you can say it one more time just to check for my
Sure.
accuracy.
That is correct. It's called So Good They Can't Ignore You. So Good They Can't Ignore You by Cal Newport. It's a book that talks about how most people will think of follow your passion and money will follow. And he actually talks about how on the opposite side that you need to refine your skills and your expertise so you become the go-to whenever there's a question or issue about a topic of importance. And that's what we talk about in advocacy, where if there's a topic, if it's food insecurity, whether it is evictions, if it is senior issues, that legislators know who they can call very quickly if they need to get data, if they need to get information, if they need to get stories that will influence or impact something that is before them. So it's just positioning yourself and your agency as a go-to resource for any questions that any decision makers may have.
Thanks, Will. We did get another question in the Q&A, and I think this is kind of going to be answered throughout the presentation, but I'm going to say it out loud now, and we can, do what we can to answer it. But I think Scarlett is going to shed some more light on this as well. Can you talk about how the householder bribery scandal influences how we understand what different interests are at play at the State House? We know they are influenced by many things, organizations, relationships. How do we make sure to get the time our issues deserve in this environment? I think that's the crux of the question, sort of how we focus in there.
Well, I guess for me, I look at the impact that issues have on people. At the end of the day, that is the constituency in which the legislators and the advocates are accountable to. So when we think about renewable energy and you're thinking about the jobs that are at stake or the impact that has on the environment, you're talking about the health that has on people. So we call that environmental justice. I'm not just talking about specifically about the bribery scandal per se, but just issues in general. We can talk about how these issues impact the people. And when we talk about in terms of health and services, especially, we talk about the social determinants of health and how decisions that are made at one point can have long lasting and high cost outcomes if we don't invest early in early childhood, or if we don't invest in seniors that could talk about social isolation. So we talk about how issues in the health and human service world affect people, and I think that is the part that in whatever the environment we find ourselves in, always at the end of the day is what it comes down to. And I think as advocates, that's what we need to keep in mind, that we're not there for ourselves. We're there to represent and to advocate and to intercede for people who we might not even know their names, but we're there to make sure that we do what we can to help them.
Thanks, Will. Sort of, I think, a related question. Sometimes it feels like legislators, particularly in Ohio, don't make decisions based on research, but on values, political choices, specific stories. Any advice on using these other tools in addition to, or sometimes in place of, kind of what research is saying? I do think this is going to get answered throughout the next portion. So I might let Scarlett touch on this, and then we can come back to it if folks feel like we have not answered it. And then
sorry,
go
Sarah.
ahead, Will. Go
I
ahead.
was going to say that sometimes I would not let the public position of a legislator impact or discourage you from advocacy or education about that particular issue. Sometimes their beliefs or their positions might be based on anecdotal evidence that may or may not be the actual case. And so when you share that information with them, that might bring a different perspective that they had not even thought about. One issue that comes to mind is public transportation. People know I'm a big advocate for public transportation. And sometimes people will talk about how, well, whenever I see a bus, it's empty, and that's like a waste of tax dollars. And one of the things that we need to be cognizant of is the relationship between bus schedules and accessibility to jobs or accessibility to healthcare. And so if those buses aren't running on a short enough interval, that could actually discourage people from using transportation. We call that a spiral, the death spiral. And so these are the types of things, again, that might be based on anecdotal evidence or stories that, if presented with data on how, in this particular case, transportation can improve economic opportunities, can improve health outcomes, then that's something that as advocates, we should make that case. In fact, I would encourage us that we have a responsibility to make that case when we see areas that might not be as informed as they could be.
Thank you. There is one more question in here about any other books to recommend about becoming a good advocate. I know that our next speaker is an author of one of them, Influence on All Cylinders. So we will make sure to share links for that. We also have a book that we produced, Follow the Money, that looks at how the budget is developed, history of the budget, up through just a few years ago. So happy to share the link for that as well. It's available online in PDFs for free. So if there are others that folks want to throw in here, I think, anyone who is interested in sharing things that have been helpful for them, please throw that into the chat. I think that would be helpful for all of our guests today. So I know that we have a poll next. So I'm gonna toss it over to Danny and Scarlett to conduct that.
Sure. Danny, do you want me to sort of do a quick rationale behind this?
Sure. The participants should be able to see the poll
Okay.
and the questions, and we do have some people answering already.
Awesome.
So yeah, go right ahead.
Awesome. So hi, everybody. I'm Scarlett Bowder, president and co-founder at Advocacy and Communication Solutions. This is something we try to do with all of our webinars, training, whether they're in person or virtual, is just to get a sense of what your most significant concerns are for our discussion today. I think I'm hearing some of them in the questions that you've posed already, but it just allows me to tighten up and refine what slides I focus on, what slides I don't focus on, and some of the content that I share or don't share throughout the conversation. So if you could just take a hot minute there and respond, and then we can get moving.